I don't know, I think hell might be the lesser of two evils.
Piss from the vine. Let us claw in the mud. Let us swing with both fists as we writhe in the blood. Let us walk on stained glass. Sinners one, sinners all. It's always prettiest after the fall.
Tonight's review is on Alleluia, The Devil's Carnival, a sequel to The Devil's Carnival. For those of you who haven't heard of these movies, they're a pretty interesting blend of genres. They're horror, fantasy, comedy, and they're also musicals. In this sequel, Lucifer is giving the damned souls in hell a chance at redemption by sending them up to heaven, and God isn't really a fan of this. He wants to settle things as quietly as he can, but Lucifer just sees him as this pompous asshole, and the two are inevitably going to go to war with one another. Meanwhile, as he did in the first film, Lucifer has a story to tell from Aesop's fables. This movie is not only a sequel to the first film, but it's also a prequel in which we learn the backstory of one of the devil's carnies. Before getting into my review, I've already mentioned this in the past, but I'm not really a fan of The Devil's Carnival 1. I love the soundtrack. I've got at least half of the songs downloaded onto my phone, and it's got some great characters in it, with Terrence Zadunik stealing the show in both movies as Lucifer. I just didn't care for the storytelling or editing. I mean, I'll admit that the ending to the movie was pretty interesting, but overall it just kind of felt like a mess. When I finally got to listen to the soundtrack to Alleluia, though, I thought that it was even better than the music from the first movie. Listening to that and watching the trailers gained my curiosity. I mean, for one thing, actually watching the movie was going to add context to the songs, and for another, if it was possible for them to make a better soundtrack, could they have made a better movie? First of all, I kind of like how they stuck to a single fable this time around. The first film had more of an anthology feel where it was three different stories. I just, and I do enjoy a good anthology, I just didn't care for the way they handled it, and I didn't honestly give a shit about anything that was happening. This movie switches things up by actually taking its time to flesh out one storyline, and I found it surprisingly investing. Also, whereas the first movie takes you to hell, this movie explores the world of heaven, which it turns out is a pretty interesting environment. For the record, if you are strongly religious and easily offended, this might not be the movie for you. Um, on a visual standpoint, heaven seems fairly idealistic. Everything has a glow to it, and everyone is always smiling and sparkling, but that's the way that God commands it to be. The reason Lucifer sees him as a pompous asshole is because in the universe that this movie takes place in, he is. Heaven is really this totalitarian dictatorship in which everything has to be perfect and everyone has to adhere to these absurd guidelines. Like, there's this one woman who apparently isn't happy enough, so she gets taken away by the heaven police. Apparently, they make her listen to the Happy Happy Joy Joy song because the next time you see her, she looks like Jack Nicholson from Batman. More than anything, I like how we're introduced to some new characters in this movie, and for anyone who is a fan of the first, you do get to see some characters from that movie pop up as well, including Emily Autumn, Ogre, and Bill Moseley, and there are even some new carnies played by the Butcher Babies. Sadly, though, no Ivan Moody this time. Anyway, going back to the characters in Heaven, it's hard to pick a single favorite out of them because there are a lot of interesting ones. Barry Bostwick plays this creepy photographer who essentially is up in heaven to spy on anyone who might be up to no good. And he does an awesome job in the movie, chews up the scenery every single time he's on screen, but One thing I didn't like was how they put this weird prosthetic on his face that didn't allow for much facial movement. He has a great musical number in the movie, but when I was watching it, it felt like I was watching some sort of fucked up parody of the Muppets. Tech Nine is in this movie as a really strict, uptight librarian. I almost said teacher because he kind of reminds me of the kind of teacher that nobody ever wanted in school. Like the type of teacher where if you had their class, then your friends would have apologized for you. With Tech Nine, though, there's a good chance you may have heard a cool song while the class was being punished. Also, the Heaven Police in this movie are played by the singers from Mindless Self-Indulgence and Morningwood, and they're essentially the comic relief of the movie. Every single time they're on screen, even if they're just in the background, they're always doing something stupid and they're always entertaining to watch. As for my favorite song from the soundtrack, it is hands down After the Fall. It's the song that I played during the intro to this video, and the scene where Lucifer sings it in the movie ended up being my favorite part. There's not a whole lot of action going on in that particular scene, but without spoiling anything, I just love the strong emotions that it represents for the main character. As far as nitpicks go, aside from Barry Bostwick's makeup, I would say that the biggest flaw in the picture is that some of the characters' motivations get a bit confusing, especially during the prequel segment. I just feel like certain parts could have been tweaked a little bit or fleshed out more to add more impact. However, at the same time, the closest comparison that I can make is that this is almost like watching the movie Labyrinth. I won't say that Alleluia is as good as Labyrinth, mostly because I don't want to get shot, but it is a similar experience in that you're having such a great time watching these crazy, eccentric characters and hearing these awesome musical numbers that the fact that much of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense really doesn't matter. So now it comes down to whether or not I actually liked this movie. In my humble opinion, Alleluia blows its predecessor out of the water. It has a better storyline, better comedy. As I've already mentioned, the soundtrack is better, and watching the movie made me appreciate it even more. I would recommend checking it out, and I hope you all have a good one.